pregnant by a black bull, or just a victim of pure human cruelty. The scandal that shattered Willow Creek will make you question everything you thought you knew about guilt, truth, and redemption. The church bells rang. Whispers turned into venom, and Grace Whitmore stood alone. But the real monster wasn't what they claimed it to be. It was far closer than anyone dared to imagine. What would you do if an entire town turned against you while you were fighting for your own life? Could you endure being called a sinner while silently bleeding for the very children you were protecting? And what if the true evil wasn't in the accused, but in the hearts of those who judged? The sun over Willow Creek that Sunday morning felt deceptively gentle, like a soft hand masking a hidden blade. St. Mary's church bells rang in crisp succession, their echoes lingering over the cracked sidewalks and faded brick walls of the little farming town. Rows of rusted pickups lined the gravel outside, the townsfolk already gathered in their best clothes, smiles fixed in place like old wallpaper, hiding crumbling plaster beneath. Inside the church, the smell of dust and polished wood mixed with faint perfume. Reverend Cole closed the service with his usual measured tone, his words about forgiveness hanging heavy in the stale air. People bowed their heads dutifully, but their minds were elsewhere. Everyone felt it, that itch of anticipation, the curiosity that burns hotter than any sermon ever could. And then, like a ripple disturbing still water, Grace Whitmore stepped into the aisle. She moved slowly, one hand grazing the back of the pews for balance, the other resting protectively over her swollen belly. Her pale blue dress, modest and simple, stretched in an odd way over her frame. And that's when it happened. The first whisper, a breath barely louder than the creak of the church floorboards. "You see her? That belly, it doesn't look right," hissed Ruth Mathers to the woman at her side, eyes fixed on Grace like a hawk eyeing wounded prey. Abigail leaned closer, her lips tightening into a cruel half-smile. "They're saying it's from Shadow. You know, the bull. Her father-in-law's bull." Ruth gasped softly, her gloved hand grazing her mouth, but her eyes sparkled with the dark thrill of scandal. Grace heard it. She always heard it. The air shifted when people talked about her, a subtle tension like the pause before a storm breaks. She kept her gaze forward, refusing to meet the stares burning holes in her back. Her fingers tightened over the curve of her stomach, a quiet defiance in the face of their judgment. But behind her, a few more whispers started, louder, more confident now that the first crack had been made. She should be ashamed. Poor James. Does he even know? God help those children if they come out like that. Every step Grace took toward the doors felt heavier, as though the wooden floorboards themselves accused her. The sound of her shoes echoed sharply against the silence, a single defiant rhythm cutting through the poison hush. Outside the church, the world seemed brighter, louder. Children played by the fountain. Men smoked by their trucks. The everyday life of Willow Creek continued, but there was a shift now, something unspoken hanging in the air like static before lightning. And then he appeared, James Whitmore, leaning against the fender of his old Ford, eyes shadowed under the brim of his hat. He straightened when he saw her coming, his jaw tight, his hands sliding awkwardly into his pockets. Grace met his gaze briefly, but she said nothing. Neither did he. They both knew words wouldn't silence what was growing in the town. The silence between them screamed louder than any confession. Behind them, the church ladies filed out in clusters. Ruth and Abigail stood just beyond the doors, heads close together, their laughter sharp and thin like cracked glass. Abigail's voice carried just enough for Grace to hear. Even the devil himself wouldn't touch her. But that animal, maybe it did. The words landed like knives. Grace stopped in her tracks. For a fraction of a second, her expression faltered. Pain flickered in her eyes, raw and unguarded. But she quickly forced it back behind the same quiet dignity she'd always carried. She didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. She simply climbed into the truck beside James. The engine roared to life, drowning out the murmurs, but it couldn't drown out the truth of Willow Creek. They wanted a monster, and they had chosen her. But wait, What really lived beneath those whispers? Was it just malice? Or fear? And what secret, what dark, unexpected truth was about a surface that none of them, not even Grace, was prepared to face? Because the real storm wasn't the gossip. It was coming, and it would break more than just silence. The screen fades from the harsh whispers of St. Mary's to the quiet expanse of open land. The Whitmore Ranch stretches for miles, a patchwork of golden fields and dry earth. The barn stands weathered and tired, its red paint peeling like old skin, the wood groaning softly under the weight of time. Dust hangs lazily in the late afternoon sun, and the faint sound of cicadas fills the air. And there, beneath the shade of an old oak, rests Shadow. The bull is enormous now. His coat, black as midnight oil, ripples faintly when the wind brushes through. His horns curve wide and proud, a silent warning of power. Yet his dark eyes, if you look long enough, hold a strange softness, something almost human, almost loyal. The camera lingers on him for a beat too long. He isn't monstrous. Not at all. Then the barn door creaks open. Grace steps out. Not the Grace from the church, who kept her chin up while whispers sliced her apart. No, this is the Grace from years ago. Younger, lighter, her hair tied loosely, her dress stained with hay and the sweat of hard work. She carries a battered bucket of water, and as she walks toward Shadow, there's no fear, no hesitation, only a quiet familiarity, like she's walking toward an old friend. You still wait for me, don't you? Her voice is soft, warm, so different from the way the town speaks about her now. She sets the bucket down, crouches beside him. Shadow shifts slightly, but doesn't move away. Grace reaches out. Her fingers brush the curve of his muzzle. He exhales through his nostrils, slow and deep, like he recognizes her touch. You were just a baby, a scared, starving baby they left to die. Her hand lingers on him. I couldn't just let you go. The camera cuts back. Years earlier, Shadow as a tiny calf, shivering and barely alive in the mud. Grace kneeling beside him, her hands trembling but determined as she wrapped him in a torn blanket. You're mine now, she whispered back then. I'll take care of you, no matter what they say. Back in the present, the Grace in the flashback smiles faintly, lost in thought. She remembers the nights she stayed in the barn, sitting against the cold wooden floor, feeding Shadow from a bottle. The mornings she carried water heavier than her own body weight just to keep him alive. And for what? Now the people who once praised her for her kindness call her monster. She presses her forehead lightly against Shadow's. You've never betrayed me. Not once. But they already decided what I am. Shadow stays still, calm, as if he understands. For a brief moment, everything is pure, quiet, tender. But then, faintly, something cuts through the silence. A voice, from beyond the barn. You talk to that thing like it's a man. Grace freezes. Her eyes flick toward the sound. The figure of James Whitmore's father, Everett, stands in the doorway. His face is hard, unreadable. A cigarette burns between his fingers, its smoke curling like a ghost. You keep spending your time here, Everett says, his voice low, sharp. People will start thinking you care more for that bull than your own husband. Grace straightens, startled. He was sick, Everett. He needed someone. Everett steps closer, his boots crunching over gravel. His stare lingers too long on her, too sharp. And now, his voice cuts. He's grown, strong, dangerous. You should have let nature take him. Shadow shifts, a low sound rumbling in his throat, protective. Everett doesn't flinch. He leans in closer to Grace, lowering his voice to something almost menacing. You're too soft, girl. That's why people don't respect you. Too soft. Grace exhales slowly, gripping the side of the bucket. He flicks his cigarette into the dirt, turns, and walks away. Grace stares after him. There's something in his eyes she can't forget. Something cruel. Something that makes her stomach tighten. The screen lingers on her face, on Shadow's stillness. Because here's the thing no one in Willow Creek knows yet. Shadow isn't the only secret on this ranch. And whatever Everett Whitmore hides behind that cold stare might be far worse than anything they're accusing her of. But wait, why did Everett really want Shadow gone? And what has Grace seen that she hasn't told anyone? Could the truth about the bull be the least shocking thing about this family? And if Shadow was the first thing they misunderstood, what's the second? The camera pulls back slowly, leaving Grace and the bull alone under the fading sun. A storm is coming, and when it breaks, it won't just destroy reputations. It will destroy lives. The bell above the door of Willow Creek General gave a sharp metallic jingle as it swung open. Inside, the air smelled faintly of stale coffee and something sweet going bad. Shelves lined with canned goods, cheap toys, and dusty sacks of flour stretched in neat rows. But the place was nearly silent. Grace stepped in first, her hand brushing the frame of the door, as though steadying herself before crossing a threshold she dreaded. Behind her came James, stiff-shouldered, his gaze locked on the floor like a man wishing he could be invisible. And trailing last was Martha, Grace's mother, holding a wrinkled list of groceries with trembling fingers. The moment they entered, every conversation stopped. It was subtle, just a fraction of a second where all movement in the room stilled. Then it shifted. Two women near the bread aisle exchanged a glance. A man by the counter cleared his throat too loudly, pretending to focus on a magazine. A teenage clerk froze halfway through stocking the milk cooler, his eyes darting from Grace's rounded belly to her face and back again. Grace walked on, slow but deliberate, pushing the squeaky-wheeled cart through the aisle. Her fingers tightened on the handle. She could feel the stares, not directly, but from the corner of her vision, from the hush of voices that dropped just low enough to sting, but not low enough to hide. She reached for a jar of peanut butter, and behind her, it came. She doesn't even look ashamed. She's walking around like she's done nothing wrong. It's disgusting. Poor James. How does he even? The whispers sliced through her like paper cuts, tiny, sharp, relentless. Grace kept her head high, but her breath caught in her throat. James, a few steps behind, heard them too. His fists clenched, nails digging into his palms. But what could he say? What could he do against the whole town? He caught sight of Abigail, the same woman from church, standing near the canned soups, pretending to read a label while her lips curled into a knowing smirk. She leaned toward Ruth, her voice low, but loud enough to echo. Maybe she likes animals more than people. Some women are strange like that. Ruth stifled a laugh behind her hand. James's face flushed with heat. He stepped closer to Grace, lowering his voice. Let go, Grace. Just get what we came for, and let's leave. They don't know anything. Grace stopped moving. She turned her head toward him slowly, her eyes shining, but not with tears. Something deeper, something heavier. Her voice was quiet, but it cut through the stale air. They don't need to know. They believe. For a moment, the world inside that grocery store held its breath. Then Martha shuffled closer, touching Grace's shoulder gently. We should go, she whispered. We don't need this. Grace wanted to leave. She wanted to turn around and escape the smell of burnt coffee and cheap gossip, but something in her refused. She reached for the next item on the list. Rice, then beans. She moved like a soldier marching forward through enemy fire, each step slow but deliberate. Behind her, the clerk couldn't help himself. Is it even human? He muttered under his breath, eyes glued to her stomach. The air snapped like a wire pulled too tight. James spun toward him. What did you just say? The boy froze, his face pale. He stammered. I didn't mean. You meant it. James barked, his voice echoing through the store. You all mean it. Every damn one of you. Silence. Thick. Suffocating. Grace stepped between James and the boy, her voice calm but brittle. James. Stop. He turned to her, his chest heaving. You shouldn't have to hear this, he said. Her lips curved into a bitter, almost broken smile. I've been hearing it my whole life. I just thought it would stop once they knew me. She glanced around at the frozen faces. But it never stops, does it? No one moved. No one spoke. Grace placed the last item in the cart, and as they walked toward the checkout counter, heads turned away like dominoes falling, one after the other. Outside, The heat was blinding. The cicadas roared again, filling the emptiness they left behind. Grace stopped by the truck, her hands gripping the edge of the cart until her knuckles turned white. James reached for her, but she pulled away slightly, not in anger, but in quiet exhaustion. "They already buried me," she whispered. "I'm still standing, but I'm not alive to them anymore." He wanted to say something, anything, but no words came. Because what if she was right? And what if, just maybe, the whispers in Willow Creek were only the surface of something even darker waiting beneath? But here's the question that no one dares to ask. What if the real secret isn't what they're accusing her of, but something far worse? And why does Grace, who seems so innocent, carry a fear in her eyes that no gossip can explain? The screen holds on Grace's face for a moment too long, just long enough for you to notice the flicker of something buried deep. Something she hasn't told James. Something she hasn't told anyone. The screen opens with a faint clang of metal on metal. The garage is dim, cluttered with greasy tools and the sharp tang of motor oil and burnt rubber. A flickering fluorescent light hums above, casting a harsh glow over dented cars and oil-stained concrete. In the corner, James Whitmore leans over an open hood, sweat running down his temple. He works in silence, methodical, his face tense, his jaw locked. He's trying to lose himself in the rhythm of tightening bolts, of checking the radiator. Anything to drown out the noise in his head. But noise always finds him. The back door creaks open, and Bill Parker strolls in, followed by Tommy Hargrove. Both men carry that smug, easy arrogance of small-town mechanics who know every secret in town, or think they do. Bill wipes his hands on a dirty rag, his grin spreading slow and deliberate. "Morning, Whitmore," he says, his voice dripping with fake friendliness. "You get much sleep last night? Or was she keeping you up?" James doesn't look up. He just keeps working, tightening the same bolt twice, like if he just keeps moving, the words won't stick. Tommy chuckles from behind. "Yeah, maybe she was up late, feeding her bull." The laughter echoes off the metal walls, thin and cruel. James freezes. His knuckles whiten around the wrench. Bill leans against the car lift, eyes glinting with mock innocence. "How's it feel, man? Raising someone else's, well," he glances toward Tommy, smirking, "or something else's." Tommy can't hold it in. He snorts. "Be honest, James. Does it even feel like a baby when it kicks? Or does it feel different?" The wrench in James's hand clatters onto the floor. The sound is sharp, final. Slowly, deliberately, he straightens. His face is calm, but it's the kind of calm that burns. His eyes are dark, locked on Bill like a man who's already made a choice. Bill notices the shift, but doesn't back down. He grins wider, the cruelty escalating. "What? You gonna pretend you don't hear it? The whole damn town's talking. Hell, if you can't keep your wife happy, maybe you should have just..." Crash. Before the words finish, James shoves him hard into the metal tool cabinet. The entire garage shakes as the cabinet rattles, tools spilling to the floor in a violent rain of steel. "Say it again," James growls, voice low, shaking. "Say it again, Bill." Bill stumbles, half laughing, half startled. "Jesus, man, calm down." "I am calm." James snaps, stepping closer. "You think you know anything? You think you're funny." Tommy tries to cut in, raising his hands. "James, hey, it's just talk, all right? Don't." James turns on him so fast that Tommy steps back, hitting the workbench behind him. "You don't get to talk about her," James says, his voice tight, controlled in a way that's more dangerous than shouting. "None of you do." Bill recovers, brushing himself off, still smirking like a fool who doesn't know when to stop. "Oh, come on. We're just saying what everyone's thinking. You're the guy raising." Slam. James's fist connects with the metal wall right next to Bill's head. The sound is deafening in the enclosed space. Bits of rusted paint flake off, drifting to the floor like dead leaves. Bill goes silent. James leans in, his voice barely above a whisper, but filled with something raw and broken. "You don't know what it's like," he says, "to hear them all, to watch them look at her like she's not human, to see her dying inside every day and not be able to stop it." Bill's grin falters. For a moment, there's something, just a flicker, of shame. But it doesn't matter. James steps back, his chest rising and falling fast. His hands tremble slightly, not from fear, but from holding back the rage he knows could swallow him whole. "I'm done here," he mutters, grabbing his jacket. Tommy tries again. "James, don't." James cuts him off sharply, his voice final. He walks out of the garage, the heavy door slamming shut behind him with a metallic thud that reverberates through the silence they leave behind. Outside, the air is thick and hot. James stops for a moment in the parking lot, his fist still clenched. And then it happens. His strength cracks. He leans against his truck, shoulders heaving, his face twisting into something caught between fury and despair. He hates them. He hates himself for not being able to protect her. And deep down, a thought he can't silence crawls into his mind. What if they're right? What if he doesn't know the whole truth? Because here's the question eating at him now. What else is Grace hiding? If the rumors are lies, why does she still look afraid? And what is it that she's not telling even him? The camera holds on James, staring into the distance, torn between love and suspicion. And somewhere in the back of the shop, Bill picks up his rag, smirking again. "You think you know a man," he mutters to Tommy, "but you never really do." The Whitmore farmhouse sat alone in the dark, the only light coming from a weak yellow glow spilling through the kitchen window. Outside, the wind rattled the bare branches against the siding, a slow, scraping rhythm like skeletal fingers clawing at the wood. Inside, Martha moved quietly through the small kitchen, her slippers whispering against the old linoleum floor. She poured herself a cup of tea, her hands shaking slightly from the weight of everything unspoken. In the next room, the old clock ticked steadily, marking time in a house that felt frozen. From down the hall came a faint creak. Martha turned, tilting her head. "Grace," she called softly. No answer. She wiped her hands on a dish rag and walked toward the narrow hallway. The house felt too silent. Grace's room was at the end. The door stood slightly ajar, just enough for a thin stripe of lamplight to spill into the hallway. "Grace!" Martha pushed the door open. Grace was sitting on the edge of her bed, her face pale as porcelain, beads of sweat clinging to her forehead. Her dress clung damply to her skin. She was hunched over slightly, one hand gripping the blanket, the other pressed tight over her swollen belly. "Mama," her voice was small, frayed. "It hurts." Martha's heart dropped. She crossed the room in 2 quick steps. "What kind of hurt?" Grace's lips trembled, like something's tearing. Martha knelt in front of her daughter, cupping her face gently. Her skin was cold. Too cold. "We need James. I'm calling him right now." Grace shook her head weakly, her eyes darting toward the window, as if someone might be watching from the darkness outside. "No," she whispered. "Grace." "Mama, don't tell them. Don't tell anyone." Her words came in a ragged gasp, and her eyes filled with a fear Martha didn't understand. Martha's voice quivered. "Baby, you're scaring me. What's happening?" Grace tried to speak, but the pain hit her full force, sharp and deep. Her body folded over itself, and a soft, strangled cry escaped her lips. She grabbed the edge of the bedpost so hard her knuckles turned white. Martha panicked. She reached for the bedside drawer, fumbling for the phone. Grace's hand shot out, gripping her mother's wrist with surprising strength. "No doctors, not yet." Her words trailed off into a faint moan. She tried to stand, but her legs gave out, and then she collapsed. "Mama, don't tell." Her voice cracked, her eyelids fluttering. Her body went limp. Martha caught her just before she hit the floor, her knees buckling under her daughter's weight. No, Grace. Stay with me." Martha shook her gently, desperately. Grace's head lolled to the side, her breath shallow and uneven. Martha's hands trembled as she pressed her fingers against Grace's neck, praying for a strong pulse. It was there, but faint. Her own panic echoed in her ears. She looked toward the hallway, toward the darkness. She had no choice. "James!" she shouted, her voice breaking. "James!" Her scream tore through the quiet farmhouse. From somewhere outside, the sound of boots on gravel, the slam of a truck door. James rushed through the front door seconds later, his face pale and frantic. What happened? She just fell. She said it hurt. She said not to call. James, we need to. But then Grace made a soft sound, a whimper so faint it was almost lost in the chaos. James dropped to his knees beside her. Grace, look at me. Stay with me. Her eyes fluttered open just enough for him to see the fear inside. And then she whispered, barely audible, don't let them know. They can't know. And her eyes closed. James looked up at Martha, his face a mask of fear and confusion. Know what? He asked, his voice low and desperate. What the hell is she talking about? Martha shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I don't know. James gathered Grace in his arms, lifting her as gently as he could. He turned toward the door. We're going to the hospital. But even as he carried her out into the freezing night, one thought clawed at the back of his mind. Why would she rather risk her life than let someone find out the truth? And what truth was she so terrified of? Outside, the engine of the old truck roared to life. The headlights cut through the darkness, carving a path toward the unknown. The house behind them stayed still, silent. But in the barn, just beyond the tree line, Shadow shifted restlessly in his pen, as if he knew something was coming, something no one was ready for. What secret could be so dangerous that Grace would rather collapse in silence than reveal it? And who, or what, is she really protecting? Because the pain in her body might not be the only thing that's killing her. The road to Memphis was long, dark, and suffocating. The truck's headlights carve a narrow path through the endless black of rural Tennessee. Inside the cab, the only sound was Grace's shallow, uneven breathing and the occasional groan of pain that escaped her lips despite her effort to stay quiet. James gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. His eyes kept flicking from the empty road ahead to her pale face slumped against the passenger seat. She looked small, fragile, like a ghost fading even before death claimed it. Mama, don't let them know, she whispered again, her words fading into nothing. Martha, sitting in the back, pressed her hands together in silent prayer, rocking ever so slightly with every bump in the road. By the time they reached the hospital, the sky was bleeding pale orange with the first hint of dawn. The building was small, old, more of a rural clinic than a real medical center. Paint peeled off its walls, and the sign out front flickered, missing half its letters. But it was all they had. Inside, the fluorescent lights were harsh, humming overhead like an angry swarm. A single nurse behind the counter looked up, startled at the sight of James carrying Grace in his arms. We need help, James barked, his voice cracking. Now, they rushed her onto a gurney, and James tried to follow, but a nurse stopped him with a firm hand. Wait here, sir. We'll let you know. He watched as Grace disappeared behind swinging double doors. The minutes stretched into an eternity. James paced the empty waiting room, his boots squeaking against the linoleum floor. Martha sat stiffly in a chair, staring at nothing, clutching her rosary so hard it left indentations in her fingers. Finally, a door opened. A doctor stepped out, his face solemn, tired. He was middle-aged, with deep lines etched into his skin, the kind of man who'd seen too many things he couldn't save. Are you her husband? The doctor asked quietly. Yes. The doctor glanced toward Martha, then back to James. He gestured toward a private consultation room. They sat. The room was sterile, cold. The doctor exhaled slowly, choosing his words like a man diffusing a bomb. Mr. Whitmore, he began, your wife is pregnant with twins. James blinked, his lips parting slightly. Twins. The doctor didn't smile. He didn't offer congratulations. His voice stayed low. But there's something else. Grace is an advanced, aggressive tumor. It's pressing against her uterus, and it's growing fast. The words hung in the air like a blade waiting to drop. James leaned back slightly, as if the chair had suddenly turned to ice. What were you saying? The doctor's eyes softened with the kind of pity James immediately hated. We need to act quickly. If we remove the tumor, There's a chance we can save her. But he hesitated. It will almost certainly mean ending the pregnancy. James felt the world tilt. His mind couldn't hold the words. And if we don't, the doctor didn't answer immediately, then the babies will have a chance. But Grace, he let the silence finish the sentence. James stared at him, unblinking. You're telling me it's one or the other? The doctor nodded slowly. Yes, we need her decision now. James swallowed hard. His throat felt like sandpaper. He stood up abruptly, his legs heavy as lead. I need to see her. The doctor led him back down the sterile hallway. Grace lay in the hospital bed, hooked to and fore, her skin pale, but her eyes alert. She'd already heard enough to understand. James sat beside her, taking her cold hand in his. They said we have to choose, he whispered, his voice breaking. If they try to save you, we'll lose them. Grace's lips trembled. She stared past him, at nothing, at everything. Or, she asked softly, where they live, in you. He couldn't finish. She closed her eyes for a moment. Her breathing was slow, measured, and when she opened them again, they were wet but steady. No, she said quietly. Not or. Them first. James shook his head. No, don't say that. Don't do this. Grace's voice cracked, but her resolve didn't. They didn't ask for this life. I did. I chose it. They're innocent. They go first. James gripped her hand tighter, desperate. Grace, please. You can't ask me to just. I'm not asking you. She interrupted gently. I'm telling you. A tear slid down her cheek. I want to give them a chance to breathe, even if it's only for a day. James bowed his head against her hand, his body trembling with silent sobs. From the doorway, the doctor watched, waiting for the verdict that would break at least one life. Grace turned her head slightly toward the doctor. Her voice was quiet, but it held the kind of strength only a mother could have. Let them live. As long as I can keep them safe, let them live. The doctor hesitated, his brow furrowing. Grace, you understand what that means? She nodded. Yes, I understand. James lifted his head, his face streaked with tears. No, we'll find another way. There has to be another way. Grace smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hurts to look at. There's not, and you know it. She placed his trembling hand over her stomach. Feel them. They're ours, and they're all I have left to give. James pressed his forehead to hers. I can't lose you. You won't lose me, she whispered. Not really. I'll still be here. In them. The doctor cleared his throat softly. I'll give you a moment. He left, closing the door behind him. James held Grace like she was made of glass. And deep down, a part of him shattered. Because he knew her choice was final. But why didn't she hesitate? Why was Grace so ready to give herself up? And what was she really hiding that made her so sure she didn't deserve to stay? As the machines beeped steadily beside her bed, Grace turned her head toward the dim window. Outside, the morning sun was just breaking, painting the sky with soft streaks of gold. She stared at it with a strange mix of peace and regret, and whispered to herself, so softly no one could hear, they'll never know. The hospital room was small, claustrophobic, bathed in the pale yellow light of a dying bulb that flickered just enough to feel wrong. The curtains hung limp, faded with time and cigarette smoke, offering no comfort, only the memory of brighter days. Grace lay in the narrow bed, a thin blanket covering her legs. Her skin was almost translucent, her lips pale, but her eyes, God, her eyes still held that quiet strength, that unshakable calm that made James feel both awe and terror. He sat at the edge of the bed, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He hadn't spoken in minutes. His breathing was uneven, like a man trying to hold back a storm he couldn't stop. Martha stood by the window, her hands clasped so tight they trembled. She watched her daughter silently, her face lined with worry and something deeper, something like dread. The doctor had left them alone, but his words still hung in the air, thick as smoke. We need her decision now. Grace shifted slightly, wincing at the movement, but her voice was steady when she spoke. I've made my choice. James's head shot up. No. Her lips curled into the faintest smile. Yes. You don't even know what you're saying, he argued, his voice low but frantic. Grace, listen to me. She cut him off, gently but firmly. I heard him, James. I understand exactly what it means. James's hands curled into fists, his knuckles white. Then how can you? How can you ask me to sit here and watch you? His voice cracked. I can't lose you. I can't. She turned her head toward him, her gaze soft but unyielding. You're not losing me, she said quietly. You're gaining them. His throat tightened. They're not even here yet. They don't even have names. You are here. You're mine. Don't do this to me. Grace reached out, her fingers brushing his. Her hand felt fragile, feather-light. They are here, she whispered. Every flutter I feel is them. Every breath I take is for them now. Martha finally spoke, her voice hoarse. Grace, maybe James is right. Maybe this is too much. Maybe you can fight this and still have another chance. Grace turned her eyes to her mother, and for a second, the mask of calm slipped just enough for them to see the raw emotion underneath. There won't be another chance, she said. Not for them. If I stop now, they stop too. James gripped her hand tighter, desperate. What about us? What about the life we're supposed to have? The plans we made? She smiled faintly, a sad, wistful smile. They are our life now. They're everything we dreamed about. I won't abandon them before they even have a chance to see the sun. James's eyes brimmed with tears, his chest rising and falling too fast. He shook his head, like he could physically reject her words. This isn't fair, he whispered. No, she agreed softly. It's not, but it's right. The silence that followed was deafening. James wanted to scream. He wanted to punch the walls, rip the curtains. Anything to stop this crushing feeling of helplessness. But he didn't. He just sat there, holding her hand, as if maybe the sheer force of his grip could keep her tied to this world. Grace lifted her other hand and placed it over her belly. She guided his trembling fingers to join hers. Feel that? She asked. He did. A faint movement, delicate but unmistakable. That's them, she said softly. That's life. Our life. They're tiny now, but they're strong. They're fighting, and I have to fight with them. James bowed his head, his tears falling onto the blanket. I don't know how to let you go. She leaned her forehead gently against his, her voice barely above a whisper. You're not letting me go. You're helping me give them everything I've left. Martha turned away, pressing her trembling fingers to her lips, tears sliding silently down her face. James pulled back slightly, looking into Grace's eyes like a drowning man searching for air. And if they don't survive? He asked, his voice breaking. Grace hesitated, and in that tiny pause was the weight of all her fear. Then at least I tried, she said. At least I gave them a chance. That's all a mother can do. James closed his eyes. His shoulders sagged, defeated. The door creaked, opened quietly. The doctor stood there, waiting. Grace didn't look at him. She kept her eyes on James. Tell him, she whispered. James shook his head slowly. Grace, tell him. For a long moment, he said nothing. His throat worked, but no sound came out. Finally, he turned his head toward the doctor, and the words tasted like ash as they left his mouth. Let her carry them. The doctor nodded solemnly and stepped back out. The room fell silent again. Grace leaned back against the pillow, her hand still over her belly. Her breathing was slow, calm, almost serene. James sat there, his heart in pieces, staring at the woman he loved more than anything, knowing she had just signed her own death sentence. But was that truly all there was to her choice? Or was Grace's sacrifice not only for her babies, but also to atone for something no one knew? What was the real reason she accepted death so easily? The camera lingers on her face, soft in the dim hospital light. And then, barely audible, she whispers something under her breath. Something James doesn't catch. But you do. They'll never know the whole truth. The Whitmore farmhouse had always been quiet, but now was silent in a way that felt alive, like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The late afternoon light filtered weakly through thin curtains, casting long, tired shadows across the wooden floorboards. The air smelled faintly of old pine and the earthy scent of rain-soaked fields. In the corner of the room, a single lamp burned low, its dim glow flickering over a figure lying still on the bed. Grace. Her skin had lost what little color it once had. She lay propped up on thin pillows, her body thinner, frilier than it had been weeks before. One hand rested on her belly, still rounded with life. Her breathing was shallow, careful, like every inhale was a fragile promise she wasn't sure she could keep. The farmhouse no longer echoed with conversation or laughter. It was filled instead with whispers of prayer, with the soft creak of the floor as Martha moved gently about the room, careful not to disturb her daughter. And then came a soft knock on the doorframe. It was Pastor Cole. He stepped inside quietly, removing his hat, as if even the weight of that gesture might be too loud for this room. He was a tall man, shoulders stooped from years of carrying other people's burdens. His eyes were kind but heavy, holding a sorrow he couldn't fully put into words. Martha looked up from the bedside, her face lined with exhaustion. "Thank you for coming," she whispered. He nodded, then turned his gaze to Grace. She smiled faintly, just enough to show she still recognized him. "Pastor," she said, her voice soft but clear. He approached slowly, pulling a wooden chair close to the bed. He sat, his large hands folded over his knees. For a moment, he just looked at her, really looked. "You've been on my heart every day," he said finally. Grace gave the smallest nod, her eyes dropping to her hands. "The babies are moving more now," she said. There was a flicker of life in her voice at that. "They're strong." Pastor Cole's eyes softened. "That's good. That's something to hold on to." Grace looked back up at him, and for the first time there was a crack in her calm. "I'm not afraid for me," she whispered. "I'm afraid they won't get to see the world. Even if I give them everything I have left, what if it's not enough?" Pastor Cole leaned closer. His voice was steady, deliberate. "Grace," he said, "faith isn't about not feeling afraid. It isn't the absence of pain. It's having the courage to carry it anyway." Her eyes glistened, but no tears fell. "Courage feels heavier than this sickness," she said quietly. "Then let it be heavy," he replied, "and let us help you carry it." She shook her head slightly. "This is mine to carry. My choice. My burden." Martha turned away, wiping her eyes with her sleeve. Grace reached for the small, worn Bible on the bedside table. Her fingers lingered over it, trembling slightly. "I pray every night," she said. "Not for me. Not even for them. I pray for the ones outside these walls. The ones who look at me and only see shame. I pray they understand one day." Pastor Cole watched her carefully. "And if they never do?" Grace gave a small, sad smile. "Then I pray they never find themselves here, choosing like this." The room fell silent again. The only sounds were the faint creak of the house settling and the steady hum of the lone lamp. Pastor Cole reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small vial of oil. He gently placed it on the table. "May I pray with you?" he asked softly. Grace nodded. He stood and placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. His voice was calm, but there was weight in it, an urgency that filled the small room. "God," he began, "you see this mother, your daughter, carrying life even as hers slips away. Give her strength beyond her strength. Wrap these children in your hands, and give us the wisdom to stand with her, even when we don't understand." Grace closed her eyes. Her lips moved silently, praying her own prayer, one she wouldn't speak aloud. When he finished, Pastor Cole stepped back. Grace opened her eyes again, looking at him with a strange kind of serenity. "Thank you," she whispered. He picked up his hat, hesitated for a moment like he wanted to say more, but instead nodded once and left quietly, his footsteps fading down the hallway. Martha moved closer, sitting on the edge of the bed. She brushed a strand of hair from Grace's face. "You're so strong," she said softly. Grace's smile was faint but steady. "Strength isn't the same as wanting to live," she said. Martha frowned. "What do you mean?" Grace stared at the ceiling, her voice barely audible. "I mean, I'm not holding on for me. I'm holding on for them, for as long as I can. But when it's time," she paused, "I'm ready." Martha felt her chest tighten. "Don't talk like that." Grace turned her head, meeting her mother's eyes with quiet finality. "It's not giving up," she said. "It's knowing when it's enough." Martha couldn't respond. She just held her daughter's hand in silence. And outside, beyond the fragile walls of that farmhouse, the town still whispered. But here, in this dim room, the only truth that mattered was the life moving softly inside Grace, and the ticking clock she couldn't escape. But was Grace truly at peace? Or was she hiding another layer of fear, even deeper than death? What exactly was she praying for when no one was listening? And what secret was still sitting, locked and waiting, inside her that no one, not James, not Martha, not even Pastor Cole, had dared ask about? Because sometimes the heaviest burdens aren't the ones you choose to carry, but the ones you keep hidden. The diner sat at the corner of Willow Creek's one real street, a squat little building with peeling white paint and a neon sign that flickered like it couldn't decide if it wanted to stay alive. Inside, the smell of burnt coffee clung to the air, mixing with the faint sweetness of pie that had been sitting out too long. The walls were yellowed from years of cigarette smoke, and the cracked leather booths sagged under the weight of too many secrets shared over too many mornings. At the far end, by the window that looked out onto the dusty main road, Abigail Cross sat with her coffee cup poised delicately between her manicured fingers. Her lips were painted too red, her hair curled just enough to look like she'd tried, but not enough to be kind. Beside her was Ruth Mathers, hunched slightly over the table like a crow guarding something shiny. Two other women leaned in close, their eyes wide and hungry. The low hum of their voices was sharper than any knife. Abigail tilted her head just so, letting her voice drop into a conspiratorial whisper, the kind that was loud enough for the next booth to hear if they were paying attention. "I heard she doesn't even come out of the house anymore," Abigail said, her lips curling in mock pity. "They say she's wasting away in there, praying." But she leaned closer, her tone dropping lower, darker. "Someone told me it's not prayer that keeps her up at night. It's something else." Ruth's eyes lit up. "What's something else?" Abigail smiled, slow and deliberate, like a cat drawing out the moment before it pounced. "They say the devil's touched her, that he mark her. That's why she's carrying." She paused, savoring the silence that followed. Ruth gasped, hand clutching at her chest. "Oh Lord, are you saying?" "I'm not saying anything," Abigail said with false innocence, stirring her coffee with a tiny silver spoon. "I'm just telling you what I heard." The woman on the end of the booth shook her head, but there was a glint of fascination in her eyes. "But her husband, James, he's still with her. Why would he stay if?" Abigail chuckled softly. "Because men are fools when they love. Or maybe he's just afraid. You know how those Whitmore men are, always covering something up." Ruth nodded sagely. "I heard he barely even works anymore. Just stays out on that farm. Maybe he's ashamed." One of the other women glanced toward the counter where an old radio was playing faint country music. She leaned in, lowering her voice. "Do you think the babies will even look human?" The table went still for a beat. Then Abigail smirked. "Who knows? Maybe they'll come out like her, cursed." They all laughed softly, that cruel, quiet laugh people use when they're trying to make their ugliness sound harmless. Behind the counter, May, the diner's waitress who'd been working there since the 60s, froze mid-step. She turned her head just slightly toward the booth, her jaw tightening. She didn't say anything, but her eyes narrowed. Back at the table, Ruth shook her head again, feigning sadness that didn't reach her eyes. "I just don't understand why the pastor keeps visiting her. It's not right. If she's made her bed with sin, she should lie in it." Abigail lifted her cup, taking a slow sip. "Because even pastors have secrets. Maybe he feels guilty. Maybe he knows more than he lets on. Maybe he's praying for himself." The other women's gasps were sharp and quick, like the sound of snakes striking. And just like that, the gossip grew teeth. A man at the counter overheard, turning his head slightly. A teenage boy in the next booth caught a piece of it, and by the time the women stood to leave, brushing crumbs off their dresses and fixing their perfect smiles, the poison was already loose. By nightfall, the story would change. By the end of the week, it wouldn't just be whispers. It would be truth in the minds of everyone in Willow Creek. Because in a town that small, lies didn't need proof. They just needed a place to grow. But here's the thing no one at that table asked. Why was Abigail so intent on keeping the story alive? What did she gain by making Grace the villain? And what secret did she hold that made her need someone else's shame to hide her own? The camera drifts from the booth as the women step outside into the bright afternoon sun, their shadows stretching long and sharp across the cracked pavement. Inside, May silently wipes down the table they left behind, her face grim. And in the distance, the Whitmore farmhouse stands alone, unaware of the fresh wave of venom heading its way. The rain came hard that night, slamming against the old farmhouse like 1,000 tiny fists. The sound was relentless, echoing through the empty halls, filling the silence with a low, haunting rhythm. Inside the bedroom, the lamp flickered weakly, barely pushing back the darkness. The walls seemed to close in tighter with every gust of wind that rattled the windows. Grace lay on the bed, drenched in sweat despite the coolness of the storm outside. Her breaths came shallow at first, uneven, uncertain, but then a sharp pain tore through her, sudden and merciless. She gasped, clutching her belly. "Mama." Her voice was small, fragile. Martha rushed to her side, her own face pale. "What is it?" "Grace, talk to me." It hurts," Grace whispered, her eyes wide, panic flashing in them for the first time. She doubled over slightly as another wave of pain rolled through her, deeper, sharper than the last. Martha's hands hovered over her helplessly. "Is it time?" "It's too early." Grace shook her head, biting back a cry. "I don't know. I can't, Mama. It's not supposed to." Her words cut off into a sob as she grabbed the sheets in a death grip, her nails digging into the fabric. Martha's heart raced. She grabbed the folded towel from the dresser and wiped Grace's forehead. "Stay with me, baby. Breathe. You have to breathe." Grace's eyes brimmed with tears. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice breaking. I didn't want it to be like this." Martha tried to keep her own fear contained. "It's okay. We'll get you to the hospital. I'll call James." No." Grace's hand shot out, grabbing her mother's wrist with surprising strength. "There's no time." Another pain hit, harder, and she cried out, her body arching. Martha's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just discomfort. This was labor, and it was too soon. Grace's tears slipped down her cheeks. She turned her head toward her mother, her voice trembling. "Mama, if I don't come back, you take care of them. You promise me." Martha froze, shaking her head violently. "Don't you say that. Don't you dare say that." But Grace's eyes, they already held the truth. She knew. "Mama," she pleaded softly, her voice cracking. "Please, promise me you'll love them enough for both of us." Martha's lip quivered. "No, you're going to hold them yourself. You're going to tell them their names yourself." Grace managed a weak smile through the pain. "And if I can't?" she asked, the question hanging in the air like a knife suspended over both of them. Another sharp contraction ripped through her body, stealing her breath. She screamed this time, a raw, guttural sound that filled the small room. Martha gripped her shoulders. "Grace, look at me. Stay with me." Grace's voice trembled, but her eyes locked on her mother's with desperate clarity. "If they have to choose, you save them." Martha blinked back tears. "No, don't make me choose. Don't." Grace's hand clutched her mother's, weak but determined. "You have to," she whispered. And then another pain hit, more intense, more violent. Grace gasped, her body shuddering. Martha grabbed the phone with shaking hands, dialing frantically. Her voice was a frantic mess of fear and urgency as she begged for help. But outside, the rain grew heavier, louder. The road was miles of mud and darkness. Would help even come in time? Martha looked back at her daughter, who was now gripping the sheets with white knuckles, tears streaking her face. Grace's eyes flicked to the ceiling. She whispered something so faint Martha almost didn't hear it. "Tell them. I wanted them." And then she cried out again, the sound echoing through the old farmhouse, swallowed by the storm. But would the storm allow anyone to reach them in time? And if help did arrive, would it already be too late? Could two fragile lives really be saved at the cost of the one slipping away in that bed? The rain pounded harder, drowning the farmhouse in darkness, while the lamp flickered one last time before dimming to a dull glow. And somewhere in the distance, headlights appeared on the road. But were they coming fast enough? The rain was no longer rain. It was a wall, a solid, merciless sheet of water pounding the earth so hard it blurred the world into gray. The headlights of James's old Chevy barely cut through the storm. Mud splashed against the windshield with every desperate turn, and the wipers fought, squealing helplessly against the downpour. The road was a twisting, narrow stretch of dirt that had already turned into a river of sludge. Inside the cab, the air was thick with panic. Grace lay slumped in the passenger seat, her face pale, damp strands of hair clinging to her skin. Her lips parted slightly, soft sounds of pain slipping through with every shallow breath. She was fading. Martha sat in the back, leaning forward, her arms wrapped around her daughter like she could hold her soul in place. Her voice shook. "She's getting cold, James. She's so cold." James's hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were ghost white. His heart slammed against his ribs. His voice was hoarse as he yelled, not at them, but at himself, at the road, at God. "Stay with me, Grace. Stay with me. Don't you leave me now, you hear me?" Another sharp bend appeared ahead, almost invisible in the sheets of rain. The truck fishtailed, tires sliding across the mud. James fought the wheel, teeth gritted, and narrowly avoided a ditch. Grace stirred slightly, a faint moan escaping her. "James," she whispered. He jerked his head toward her for a split second. "I'm here. I'm right here, baby. Don't close your eyes." Her hand twitched, reaching weakly toward her belly. She winced, her voice barely a breath. "They are moving." James's chest tightened like a vice. "Good. That's good, Grace. Just hold on a little longer. We're almost there. Almost there." From the back, Martha's prayers grew frantic, tumbling out like broken fragments. "Lord, please, please, don't take her yet. Please." A flash of lightning ripped across the sky, blinding white. For a second, the whole road was illuminated. The flooded ditches, the fallen branches, the endless rain swallowing everything. And then, darkness again. James squinted through the streaked windshield. He couldn't see the turnoff to the main road. Couldn't see anything. The truck jolted violently as it hit a pothole, sending Grace's body forward slightly. She let out a weak, pained gasp. James's voice cracked. No, 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 Grace, hang on. I'm not letting you go. Not like this." Another contraction hit her. Her cry was faint, but full of agony. Martha gripped her daughter's hand, tears streaming down her face. "She's slipping, James. She's slipping away." James pressed the accelerator harder, the engine growling as the truck sped through the storm. The wheels struggled for traction, throwing up mud like blood splatter. And then, suddenly, the road disappeared underwater. A flash flood had swallowed the low bridge ahead. The only path to the hospital was now a swirling, churning mess of brown water and debris. James slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a halt, tires sinking into the mud. He stared through the windshield at the raging flood, his chest heaving. His mind spun. If he tried to cross, they might drown. If he turned back, Grace would die before they ever made it out. He looked at her again. Her head was leaning to the side now, her eyelids half closed, her breathing shallow and uneven. "James," she whispered faintly, almost inaudibly. "If it's too late for me, save them." "No," he barked almost violently. "Don't you dare say that. I'm saving all of you." Another bolt of lightning lit the sky, and in that moment, James saw his own reflection in the glass. His face twisted, drenched in sweat and rain, a man on the edge of breaking. Martha's voice shook from the back. "What do we do?" James's eyes darted between the flood and his wife. He had seconds to decide. Seconds. And then, Grace's body jerked as another wave of pain hit her, sharper, deeper than the others. She gasped, her lips trembling. James, I can't. And her head fell limp. No. James leaned over, shaking her gently. Grace, stay with me. Look at me. Look at me. Her chest rose faintly. Once. Twice. But slower now. Martha sobbed behind them. She's fading, my God, she's fading. The storm roared louder, like the sky itself was mocking them. James slammed his fist against the steering wheel, his scream raw, primal. Somebody help us. But there was no one. No headlights in the distance. No way forward. Only the flood. Only time running out. Would he risk the flood and gamble all their lives? Or would he watch the woman he loved slip away in his arms, knowing help might never come? And what choice could a man live with when every option ends in loss? The truck sat there, engine idling, surrounded by darkness and rain. Grace's breathing grew shallower. The babies inside her kicked faintly, as if reminding him they were still there. 2 lives waiting to be born. 1 life slipping toward the edge. And James caught between them, alone in the storm. The fluorescent lights in the small hospital flickered, humming faintly like tired insects. The walls were a dull, chipped white, with faint stains of time and where that no amount of bleach could erase. The air smelled sharp, antiseptic mixed with the faint metallic scent of fear. Grace was wheeled in on a rusted gurney, her skin pale as paper. Beads of sweat clung to her forehead despite the chill of the hospital corridor. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, each one weaker than the last. James stumbled behind her, his hands trembling as he tried to keep up. His boots squeaked against the floor, echoing in the too quiet hallway. Please, just save her, he said, his voice breaking, as if begging the walls themselves to answer. A nurse pressed a hand against his chest, stopping him. Sir, you can't come past this point. Let us work. I have to be with her. James's voice cracked with raw desperation, but they were already wheeling her away, double doors slamming shut with a hollow, final thud. Inside the operating room, the world narrowed to frantic movements and clipped, urgent voices. Vitals dropping. We need to move faster, the surgeon barked. Grace's eyes fluttered open weakly. The lights above her blurred and doubled. She could feel the cold bite of metal instruments against her skin, the strange, detached sensation of being half in her body and half somewhere else entirely. A mask covered her face. She tried to lift her hand, but it barely moved. Grace, a nurse said gently, leaning close. Stay with us, honey. You're not done yet. You hear me? Grace tried to speak, but only a whisper escaped. They're all that matters. Then came a sharp, sterile slice of metal against flesh. The surgeon's voice cut through the haze. We're in. Prep for immediate extraction. Blood. Too much blood. It pooled in ways that made even the most seasoned nurse glance away for a half second. Baby one is crowning, someone shouted. Tiny, fragile hands emerged first. The room seemed to hold its breath as the surgeon gently, carefully pulled the impossibly small infant free. The baby didn't cry. Not right away. A nurse rushed forward with a towel, her movements precise but urgent. Come on, little one. Breathe for us. Then, finally a weak, thin cry. Barely more than a whimper. But it was life. Baby went out. The nurse called, her voice shaking just slightly. But there was no time to pause. The second baby came next, even smaller, limbs trembling like fragile glass. The doctor's brow furrowed. They're premature. Get the incubators prepped. Now, another faint cry filled the room. A sound so delicate it almost hurt to hear. Grace turned her head slightly, her lips parting in the faintest smile. They're here, she whispered, but her body was failing. The monitors beeped erratically. Her blood pressure's crashing, a nurse called out. Clamp that artery now. Grace's eyelids fluttered. She tried to focus on the blur of movement around her. James, she whispered faintly, though he wasn't there to hear. Tell them, I love them. Her head tilted slightly to the side. Stay with me. Grace, the surgeon commanded. We're not losing you. Not now. They worked frantically, hands moving like clockwork, but the blood kept coming, slipping through their gloves like water. On the other side of the doors, James sat hunched in a hard plastic chair, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tight enough to hurt. He stared at the floor, unable to blink, unable to move. Martha sat beside him, her lips moving in silent prayer. From behind the swinging doors came faint cries. Babies crying. James's head snapped up, his heart lurching in his chest. He stumbled toward the nurse's station. Are those my children? Are they? The doors opened and a nurse stepped out, holding 2 tiny bundles wrapped in sterile blankets. Her expression was unreadable. They're here, she said softly. James took 1 step forward, his breath catching. The babies were so small. Their faces were pink and wrinkled, their fists no larger than his thumb. One stirred slightly, letting out a weak, whimpering cry. The other lay still, just breathing, shallow and fragile. They'll need the NICU immediately, the nurse explained. They're fighters, but it's touch and go. James carefully reached out and touched the edge of one blanket, his hand trembling. They're alive, he whispered, like he needed to convince himself. They're alive. But before he could even process the miracle in front of him, a second nurse rushed through the same doors, her expression tight. She's losing too much blood, she called to the others. James froze. No, this wasn't the way it was supposed to go. Grace, he asked, his voice rising in panic. What's happening to my wife? The nurse holding the babies hesitated. She didn't answer. James looked past her into the dimly lit hallway beyond the doors. All he saw was movement. Doctors, nurses, rushing. He heard the frantic beeping of a machine. And then, flatline. A chilling, endless tone that cut straight through him. No, he whispered. No. But was that really the end? Or would Grace somehow pull herself back from the brink, even after her body had given out? And if she didn't, who would tell the twins the truth of what really happened that night? Would they ever know the depth of what their mother gave for them? The cries of the newborns echoed softly down the corridor. James stood there, holding 2 tiny lives in his shaking arms. But one life, the one that had carried them, hung on a thread beyond those doors. The hospital room was unbearably still, except for the steady, mechanical beeping of the heart monitor. It was the kind of sound that was meant to be reassuring, but in that moment, it felt like a cruel reminder that Grace was here, but not really here. She lay motionless on the narrow hospital bed, her skin pale and almost translucent under the dim fluorescent lights. Tubes snaked into her arms, an oxygen mask rested over her face, and the thin hospital blanket barely hid how fragile she had become. James sat in the hard plastic chair beside her, his back hunched, his elbows resting on his knees. He stared at her hand, the hand that used to grip his so firmly, and now it was cold, limp, lifeless in his. Martha stood near the window, her arms wrapped tightly around herself, as though trying to hold in all the emotions threatening to spill out. Her lips moved in silent prayer, but her eyes were full of fear she couldn't hide. And then Pastor Cole stepped in quietly, his presence soft but heavy, like a shadow stretching across the room. He removed his hat and held it against his chest, his voice low. How is she? James didn't answer. He didn't even look up. She hasn't moved, Martha whispered, her voice cracking. Not once since she couldn't finish the sentence. Pastor Cole sighed, glancing at Grace with sorrowful eyes. She's resting. That's all we can believe right now. Resting. But James finally lifted his head, his face a storm of exhaustion, grief, and anger. Resting. His voice was sharp, raw. She's not resting. She's trapped in there. And I can't reach her. He turned back to Grace, his hand trembling as he gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. Grace, his voice dropped to a whisper. Can you hear me? It's me. It's James. The heart monitor kept its steady rhythm. No change. They're here, he continued, choking on the words. The babies are babies. Lily and Jacob. They're so small, Grace, but they're fighting, just like you would want them to. His throat tightened. He squeezed her limp hand a little harder. But they need you. I need you. His tears slid down, dropping onto the sterile white sheet. Please don't leave us now. You made it this far. You gave everything. Please, Grace, come back to us. Martha turned her head away, clutching the cross around her neck as silent tears streamed down her face. Pastor Cole stepped closer to the bed. James, he said gently, sometimes the body needs time to find its way back. Don't lose faith now. But James shook his head slowly, his voice barely holding together. What if she's already gone? What if all that's left is just this? He gestured to the lifeless body, the machines. How do I tell our children their mother chose them, but they'll never see her smile? Pastor Cole didn't answer. There was no easy answer. James leaned closer to Grace, his forehead almost touching hers. Grace, he whispered, his voice breaking completely now. If you can hear me, I swear I'll raise them the way you wanted. I'll tell them how brave you were, how much you love them. He let out a shaky breath. But please, please don't make me do it alone. The monitor beeped steadily, cold and unchanging. Silence filled the room again, and in that silence, every second felt heavier than the last. But what was happening inside Grace's mind? Was she drifting somewhere far beyond their voices, unable to return? Or was she there, locked in a darkness she couldn't escape? Could she feel his hand holding hers? Could she hear the tremble in his voice? And if she could, would she have the strength to fight her way back? The camera lingers on her still face, the faint reflection of James's tears glistening in her closed eyes. And somewhere, down the hall, the soft cries of Lily and Jacob echoed faintly, waiting for the mother who may never come. The neonatal unit was unnervingly quiet, the kind of silence that felt heavy, like the air itself was holding its breath. Only the faint mechanical hums of incubators broke the stillness, along with the soft, rhythmic beeps of monitors that measured the fragile lives inside. Through the glass walls, tiny forms lay under the warm glow of heat lamps. Lily and Jacob were impossibly small, their skin still a soft pink, so thin it looked translucent under the hospital's dim lights. Their chests rose and fell with shallow, tentative breaths, each one a miracle on the edge of breaking. James stood just inches from the incubators, his hand pressed flat against the cool glass. His eyes, bloodshot from nights without sleep, never left them. They're so small, he whispered, his voice almost too soft for the nurse beside him to hear. She nodded, offering him a faint, tired smile. Yes, but they're fighters. I can see it already. He let out a shaky breath, his forehead gently leaning against the glass. I wish you could hear me, he whispered to the two fragile forms. I wish you could know that I'm right here, that I'm not going anywhere. The nurse adjusted one of the tubes connected to Jacob's tiny hand. They need time and care. It's going to be a long road. I'll give them anything they need, James said immediately. I'll sell every damn thing I own if I have to. The nurse hesitated, then nodded. They're stable for now, but premature babies can change in an instant. It's unpredictable. James closed his eyes, swallowing hard. Unpredictable. Yeah, I know something about that. Later that night, the hospital halls were dim and empty, the only light coming from the soft glow of vending machines and exit signs. James sat on an old bench near the neonatal wing, holding his head in his hands. His body ached from exhaustion, but he couldn't leave. In his pocket was the last wad of cash he had managed to gather after selling his truck. The same truck his father had given him, the one that held years of memories from working the ranch. Gone now, just like the saddle he sold and the tools. Everything was disappearing piece by piece, but none of it mattered, because the only things that mattered were behind that glass. He stood again, despite the pain in his legs. He couldn't help it. He had to see them one more time. Back at the incubators, the nurse on duty glanced at him, her face soft with sympathy. Mr. Whitmore, she said quietly, you should try to rest. You've been here for 3 days straight. I'm fine, he said, his eyes locked on Lily's tiny fingers, barely twitching in her sleep. I can't leave them. The nurse studied him for a moment, then sighed. You're a good father. James didn't respond. He just leaned closer, his palm once again against the glass. Hey, you too, he whispered. It's Daddy. I'm here. Your mom, she's still fighting too. She's just down the hall. His voice cracked. So you have to fight for her, okay? For me. For her. For all of us. Don't you dare give up on me. Hours passed. Time blurred into the endless hum of machines. James dozed off in the chair outside the unit, only to wake with a jolt at the faint sound of alarms. He jumped to his feet, his heart in his throat. Inside the neonatal unit, one of the monitors was flashing red. Jacob's tiny body trembled as nurses rushed in, their voices urgent but controlled. His oxygen is dropping. Increase the flow. James pressed his face to the glass, panic surging through him. What's happening? What's wrong? The nurse at the door turned sharply. We need you to stay outside, sir. No. His voice cracked, raw and desperate. That's my son. That's my. But they had already surrounded the incubator, working frantically, blocking his view. James banged his hand against the glass once, twice, before sliding down the wall, breathless and trembling. He could only hear snippets of their words. Pressure dropping. Try again now. Come on, baby boy, stay with us. And then a sound. A cry. Weak but there. James's heart stopped, then pounded harder than ever before. The nurse turned to him through the glass, her face softening with relief. She gave him a nod. He exhaled shakily, pressing his palm to the glass again. That's it, Jacob. You hold on, son. You hold on. He turned his eyes to Lily in the incubator next to him. You too, baby girl. Daddy's right here. I'm not going anywhere. But how long could James keep this up? How long before exhaustion, money, and hope itself ran out? And what would he do if he was forced to choose between saving Grace or saving the twins? The camera lingers on James's reflection in the glass, his tired eyes staring back at himself, surrounded by machines keeping his children alive. Behind him, the empty hallway stretches endlessly, quiet and cold. And down the hall, in a darkened room, Grace still lies unmoving, her own battle unseen. The diner was full that afternoon, the smell of stale coffee and fried bacon hanging heavy in the air. Old ceiling fans creaked above, pushing around the lazy southern heat. The hum of idle chatter filled the space, punctuated by the occasional clink of ceramic cups against worn wooden tables. In the far corner, Abigail sat with her ever-present pearl necklace resting stiffly against her neck. She stirred her coffee slowly, her sharp eyes scanning the room like a hawk. Across from her sat Ruth, leaning in closer, her voice hushed but dripping with satisfaction. She hasn't shown her face in weeks, Ruth said, her tone equal parts curiosity and judgment. Not a single time at church, not even at the market. Abigail smirked faintly, lowering her voice even more. Oh, Ruth, she won't. She's hiding. That kind of shame doesn't just go away. A man at the next table tilted his head slightly, pretending not to listen while clearly hanging on every word. Ruth leaned closer, her voice trembling with false piety. You think it's true? The things they said about her? About that animal? Abigail didn't even flinch. She just raised an eyebrow and took a sip of her coffee, savoring the pause before answering. People don't invent such stories out of nowhere. Where there's smoke, she let the sentence dangle, deliberately unfinished, letting the implication burn deeper. The man at the other table finally interjected, unable to help himself. I heard she's not even in Willow Creek anymore. Packed up and left in the middle of the night. No, Ruth whispered wide-eyed. Ran away. Maybe, Abigail said, her lips curling into a small, self-satisfied smile. Or maybe she's hiding in shame because God finally caught up with her. You know what they say. He doesn't let sin go unpunished. There was a murmur of agreement from another booth. Someone else chimed in, a younger waitress who pretended to be uninterested but couldn't resist. I heard she's sick, like really sick. But, you know, she shrugged with a mocking tone. Maybe that's just the price for what she did. A ripple of dark amusement swept through the diner. Ruth pressed her hand dramatically against her chest. Well, I'm not one to judge. Abigail gave her a pointed look. Of course not. But still, some things can't be ignored. And the Lord has his ways. A faint chuckle came from the counter. Guess you can't fool everyone forever. Huh. She thought she could just parade around, pretending to be holy, but the truth always finds a way out. Abigail nodded knowingly, setting her coffee cup down with a soft clink. She thought she was better than the rest of us. But look how it turned out. No one can escape the weight of their own actions. The words lingered in the air like poison, spreading quietly but quickly, as they always did in Willow Creek. Outside, through the diner's dusty windows, you could see the town square where Grace once stood, smiling politely at these same people who now tore her apart piece by piece with their words. But none of them knew the truth. They didn't know about the sterile hospital room, the quiet beeping of machines keeping her alive. They didn't know about the two fragile babies who were fighting for every breath while their father sold everything he owned just to keep them alive another day. And they didn't know that Grace, unconscious in her hospital bed, was the farthest thing from a sinner. But would they care even if they did? Abigail leaned back, her lips curling into a smug smile as she added the final blow. She paid the price. Whatever's happening to her now, that's on her soul. The group nodded in silent agreement, their coffee cups clinking together like a toast to their own self-righteousness. And yet, somewhere in that moment, did any of them feel even a flicker of guilt? Did any of them truly believe they were innocent in the face of the suffering they were helping to deepen? Or was the lie too comfortable, too easy to keep believing? The camera would linger on the window of the diner, catching the reflection of their faces, smiling, gossiping, self-assured, before shifting to the long, empty road that led away from town. The same road James had driven down in the storm, Grace barely breathing beside him. The same road he would have to take again when the truth finally came back to face them all. The hospital room was dimly lit, the soft glow of a single lamp casting long, tired shadows across the sterile white walls. Outside, the world was silent except for the distant hum of passing cars and the occasional faint cry from the neonatal unit. Inside, the steady beep of Grace's heart monitor felt deafening, each sound a cruel reminder that she was alive, but only barely. James sat hunched in the chair beside her bed, his hands clasped so tightly they trembled. His eyes were hollow, dark circles etched beneath them, his clothes wrinkled and stained with the exhaustion of too many sleepless nights. He stared at Grace's still face, her pale lips parted slightly as she lay motionless, tubes and wires snaking around her fragile body. He swallowed hard, the words lodged in his throat for too long finally breaking free. "I don't understand." His voice cracked like a dry branch. "She doesn't deserve this." Pastor Cole stood near the foot of the bed, silent at first, his weathered hands folded in front of him. He was an older man with a kind face, but even he seemed to be struggling to find the right words. James's voice grew louder, raw with anguish. "Why her, Pastor? Why not me? She's the kindest soul I've ever known. She wouldn't hurt a fly. And yet here she is, fighting for her life. And those babies, God, those tiny little babies fighting for every breath. For what?" He slammed his fist against his thigh, the frustration erupting from deep within him. "Do you have any idea what it feels like to watch the person you love more than your own life waste away in front of you while people out there," he pointed vaguely toward the window, toward Willow Creek, "are out there laughing, making up stories about her, condemning her, acting like she brought this on herself." His breathing quickened, his chest rising and falling with the weight of everything he'd held in for weeks. Tears blurred his vision as he turned his face toward the pastor. "I've prayed. I've begged. I've done everything I could. And still," his voice faltered, almost a whisper, "still, she's slipping away." For a moment, the only sound was the steady, haunting rhythm of the heart monitor. Pastor Cole stepped closer, his voice calm but firm, layered with the kind of sorrow only a man who'd seen too much pain could carry. "James," he began gently, "I wish I had an answer that would take this ache from your chest. But I don't. None of us do." James shook his head, tears streaking his face. "So that's it. Just silence. Is this what God does? Test people until they break." The pastor drew a deep breath, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the purest souls are asked to carry the heaviest crosses, not because they've done wrong, but because their love, their sacrifice, their pain becomes a light for others. Grace is more than her suffering. She's teaching all of us what it truly means to love without conditions." James's lips trembled, his voice a rasp. But what if she doesn't wake up? What if this is the end for her? Pastor Cole placed a hand gently on James's shoulder, his eyes steady. "Then it won't be the end, James. Not truly. Love like hers doesn't disappear. It leaves a mark on everyone it touches, even in silence, even in death." James let out a broken laugh that was more like a sob. "I don't want marks. I don't want lessons. I just want her back." The pastor didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at Grace's still form, then at James, whose face was etched with raw despair. Finally, he said quietly, "This is not the end of her story, or yours. Have faith, even when it feels impossible." James turned back to Grace, brushing a strand of hair from her forehead, his hand trembling. "Please," he whispered to her, "if you can hear me, fight. Fight your way back to us." The camera would linger on his face, twisted with grief, then shift slowly to the heart monitor. Beep, 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 steady but fragile. Outside the hospital window, the night stretched endlessly, offering no answers. But what if, just what if Grace could hear him? What if, deep within the darkness of her coma, she was trying to find her way back? Or was she already too far gone? The hospital room was wrapped in a fragile kind of stillness, the kind that feels as if the entire world is holding its breath. Morning light crept gently through the blinds, painting soft streaks of gold across Grace's pale face. Machines hummed quietly around her, their rhythmic beeps the only sign she was still tethered to life. James sat slumped in the corner, his body folded in exhaustion. His head rested in his hands, his fingers tangled in his hair, the weight of endless nights and unanswered prayers pressing on his chest. He hadn't moved in hours, afraid that if he closed his eyes, she might slip away for good. Martha was beside Grace's bed, her frail hands gently brushing her daughter's arm. She whispered a silent prayer, her lips trembling with words she barely believed anyone could hear anymore. Then, so soft it could have been imagined, Grace's fingers twitched. At first, it seemed like nothing, a trick of the light, a phantom movement. But then it happened again, deliberate, faint, yet undeniably real. Martha froze, her breath caught in her throat. "James," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't look up. He was too deep in his own grief to hear her at first. "James," she said again, this time with a trembling urgency. Look. His head shot up, confusion flashing across his hollowed eyes. He followed her gaze to the bed, just as Grace's lips parted, a dry, fragile sound slipping out. "Jonas." For a heartbeat, the world stopped. James stumbled to his feet, his hands shaking as he reached for her. "Grace." His voice cracked, a mix of disbelief and hope colliding violently in his chest. "Grace. Oh my God. Grace." Her eyelids fluttered open, slow and heavy, revealing eyes that looked both lost and aware all at once. Her gaze darted weakly, finding his face like it was the only thing anchoring her to this world. "Are they?" Her voice was almost inaudible, every word a struggle. "Are they okay?" James dropped to his knees beside her bed, grabbing her frail hand and pressing it to his lips. Tears streamed down his face, hot and relentless. "They're alive," he whispered, his voice breaking under the weight of the moment. "Our babies are alive, Grace. And so are you." Her lips curled into the faintest ghost of a smile, tears pooling at the corners of her eyes. I knew you'd keep them safe," she breathed. Martha let out a sob, clutching her own chest as if to steady her racing heart. The room was flooded with an emotion so heavy it seemed to fill the air, thicker than the sterile smell of the hospital. James couldn't stop touching her face, as if afraid she would disappear if he let go. "You came back to me," he said through tears. I thought I lost you. I thought. She weakly squeezed his hand, a flicker of strength that sent shockwaves through his heart. You can't get rid of me. That easy, she whispered with a hint of fragile humor that only made him cry harder. For a moment, it was as if the weight of all the pain, the whispers, the cruel lies from the town, the endless nights of fear, all of it cracked open to let a single beam of hope through. But in the corner of the room, the machine still beeped steadily, a reminder that her fight wasn't over. She was awake, yes, but her body was still fragile, her recovery uncertain. And somewhere out there, in Willow Creek, the rumors hadn't stopped. Would this fragile miracle last? Or was it only a fleeting moment before another storm came crashing down? The first morning after Grace was discharged from the hospital was quiet, almost deceptively so. The air smelled faintly of rain-soaked soil, and the old Whitmore farmhouse seemed both familiar and foreign to her now. She stood at the doorway with trembling legs, her hand clutching James's for balance, the weight of months spent in bed still heavy on her fragile body. Every step was a battle. Inside, the house bore the scars of time and silence. The wooden floors creaked under her hesitant movements, and the family photos along the hallway stared back at her like silent witnesses of a life she almost didn't return to. Martha followed behind, carrying the twins, Lily and Jacob, wrapped in soft, pale blankets. They were still so small, but stronger now than the day they were born. Their quiet breaths were the sound of hope itself. Grace paused midway through the hall. Her breathing grew uneven, her legs quivered under her own weight. For a split second, she looked as though she might fall. James instantly reached to steady her. "Do you want to sit?" he asked gently, his voice carrying the protective edge born from months of fear. But Grace shook her head, her pale face lit with quiet determination. "No," she whispered, her voice still soft but firm. "I need to see them." Standing, her eyes, still tired, still shadowed with the memory of pain, locked onto the crib waiting in the living room. It was a simple wooden crib, handmade by James during the long nights when hope felt far away. With each step, Grace felt her body scream in protest, but she didn't stop. She wouldn't. When she finally reached the crib, Martha gently laid the twins inside. Their tiny fingers curled reflexively, as if sensing their mother's presence. Grace leaned forward, gripping the edge of the crib for support, her breathing shallow and shaky. She reached for them. Her fingers brushed Lily's cheek first, then Jacob's. Her eyes filled instantly with tears, not of pain, but of gratitude too deep for words. "They're warm," she whispered, almost in disbelief. "They're really here." James stood just behind her, his hands on her shoulders, his own eyes wet but silent. He had no words left. He'd used them all in prayers that felt unanswered until this moment. Grace slowly turned, collapsing gently into his arms, her voice breaking into a sob that wasn't entirely sad nor entirely joyful. "It was worth it," she breathed. "Every single pain." Her tears fell onto his shirt as she clung to him. Behind them, Martha watched quietly, holding back her own emotions. She'd seen her daughter nearly slip away, seen the life drained from her eyes in that cold hospital room. And now she was standing, holding her babies, breathing life back into this broken home. But even in this moment of fragile peace, there was an unspoken tension. Outside these walls, Willow Creek still whispered. They still believed the lies. Would they ever know the truth? Would they even care? Or would Grace have to live with the weight of being seen as something she never was, while her children grew up under the shadow of that cruelty? The wind outside rattled the windows, as if reminding them that peace was never permanent. Because just as Grace felt she was reclaiming her life, something else waited beyond the farmhouse, something that might shatter this fragile calm. The sun was low over Willow Creek, casting long, sharp lines of light and shadow across the worn cobblestones of the town square. The bell of St. Mary's rang faintly, its echo cutting through the murmurs of townsfolk lingering outside after Sunday service. And then it happened. A hush rippled through the crowd. People turned, their expressions first confused, then startled, and finally unsettled. Grace Whitmore was walking toward them. She moved slowly but deliberately, her figure fragile yet strangely resolute. In her arms, she carried Lily, tiny but very much alive. Beside her, James held Jacob against his chest. The babies were bundled in soft white blankets, their small faces just visible, their breaths like whispers of proof that life could defy every expectation. No one spoke at first. It was as if the entire town had collectively forgotten how to breathe. Abigail dropped her hand back. Her voice trembled as it slipped out of her mouth, barely above a whisper. "It's her, but how?" Ruth stepped closer to her friend, her eyes narrowing as if she didn't trust what she was seeing. "She was supposed to be gone," she muttered. "They said she..." She stopped herself, glancing around as if the very truth of her words might summon some kind of reckoning. Grace stopped in the very center of the square. She didn't speak, didn't smile. She simply stood there, holding her daughter in her arms like a living shield, her gaze steady. It wasn't defiant, but it wasn't meek either. For months, they had whispered. For months, they had said she was cursed, that her sickness was a punishment, that she'd run away in shame, that God himself had turned his back on her. And yet, here she was. James took a step closer to her, his eyes darting to the crowd like a man prepared for a fight. He felt the weight of every glance, every rumor, every poison-filled word that had nearly destroyed the woman he loved. Someone in the back of the crowd gasped. "She's holding children. Her children." The whispers grew louder. "Are they human? Wasn't she dying? Why would she come back here?" Grace's heart was pounding, but her face remained calm. She looked directly at Abigail, who had been the loudest voice spreading the vilest stories, and held her gaze. In that moment, no words were needed. The truth wasn't in what Grace could say. It was in the fact that she stood there, alive, holding the very proof of her sacrifice. But Abigail couldn't look at her for long. She turned away, muttering to Ruth, "It doesn't mean anything. God still punished her. Look at her. She's a shadow of what she was." Ruth nodded, but there was hesitation in her eyes now, a flicker of doubt. James felt his fists clench, but Grace reached for his hand gently, stopping him. She didn't want anger. Not here. Not now. She looked at the faces around her, faces that had condemned her, prayed for her downfall, and buried her in lies. And she asked, in a voice soft but sharp enough to cut through the silence, "Are you going to keep looking at me like I'm a ghost? Or will you see the truth for what it is?" Her words hung in the air. Some shifted uncomfortably. Some looked ashamed. Others, like Abigail, looked angry, almost threatened by the sight of a woman they could no longer define. The church bell tolled again, louder this time, and as it echoed, a question settled into the minds of everyone present. Would Willow Creek finally admit it had been wrong? Or would it choose, yet again, to cling to the comfort of its lies? Because what Grace had done, what she had survived, didn't just challenge their gossip. It exposed something deeper about them. The square was silent, so silent you could hear the faint creak of the church's weathered wooden sign swaying in the breeze. Grace stood there, her shoulders trembling under the weight of everything unsaid for far too long. Lily stirred faintly in her arms. Jacob squirmed lightly against James's chest. The babies were alive. She was alive. And yet, the air around her felt heavy, poisonous, thick with unspoken guilt and lingering judgment. Dozens of faces stared back at her, some with disbelief, some with shame, and some, still, with that same cold suspicion that had nearly destroyed her. She drew in a shaky breath. Her lips parted once, closed, then again. Her voice came out soft, but carried through the stillness like a blade of glass. It wasn't shadow. The crowd flinched. She stepped forward. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't sin. It wasn't the devil. Her eyes locked onto Abigail, who stiffened and stepped slightly back. Grace's tone grew stronger, though her tears rolled freely. It was a tumor pressing on two lives inside of me. Lives I chose to protect, even when it meant I might not survive. Someone gasped. Ruth covered her mouth, her eyes darting from Grace to the twins, then back to the ground. Grace took another step. She didn't look away from the faces that had once spat venom behind her back. "While you whispered," she said, her voice breaking but fierce, "I was on an operating table. While you called me cursed, I was bleeding out. While you told your children to stay away from mine, I was fighting to make sure they had a chance to live." The silence thickened. Grace's fingers clutched Lily closer. Her voice wavered, but it didn't lose its fire. "It wasn't the cancer that almost killed me." Her gaze swept the entire square, capturing every eye, daring them to look away. "It was your tongues." The words hit like a hammer, echoing in the hollowness of the square. Abigail stepped forward, her face pale. We didn't know." Grace cut her off, her voice trembling, but firmer now. "You didn't ask. You didn't care. You want his story, not the truth." Martha moved closer to her daughter, placing a hand on her shoulder, steadying her. James's jaw was tight, his knuckles white around Jacob, but he stayed silent, letting Grace's words pierce through the hypocrisy that hung in the air. Pastor Cole stepped forward then. He didn't speak at first. He only looked at the people of Willow Creek, the ones who filled his pews every Sunday, who sang hymns but sharpened their words like knives. Finally, he spoke, his voice low, heavy. "Shame isn't just in what you do. It's in what you allow. And all of us allowed this." Someone in the back sobbed. Others shifted uncomfortably, heads dropping. But still, some refused to meet Grace's eyes. Grace's breathing was unsteady now. "I stood at death's door to bring them into this world. And I will spend every day teaching them not to become what this town tried to make of me." She turned, clutching Lily protectively. James followed, holding Jacob. They began walking toward the edge of the square, leaving the silence to crush the people behind them. But just as she reached the church steps, a voice rang out. One trembling, one full of something deeper than fear. "Grace!" It was Ruth. She stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. I didn't." Grace stopped, but didn't turn fully. Ruth swallowed hard, looking at the twins, then at Grace's frail frame. "Can we make this right?" The question hung there, unanswered. Could they? And as Grace turned slightly, meeting Ruth's eyes with an unreadable expression, another voice whispered among the crowd, soft but insistent. "Or is it already too late?" The square was suffocatingly quiet. The same people who had once filled this space with their cutting whispers now stood frozen, their eyes darting anywhere but at Grace. The weight of her words still echoed in the air like a haunting bell they couldn't unhear. Lily let out a soft cry in Grace's arms, a sound so pure, so innocent, it shattered whatever scraps of self-righteousness were left among the crowd. Abigail, who had been the loudest voice of them all, shifted uneasily. Her hands fidgeted with the hem of her blouse. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She finally stammered, her voice shaking. "We didn't know, we just thought." Pastor Cole stepped forward. His usually warm, calming presence now felt like a heavy storm rolling in. His eyes swept across the townspeople, hard and unyielding. "Thought what, Abigail?" His tone was low, deliberate. "That your gossip was harmless? That your silence in the face of cruelty was excusable?" Abigail's lips trembled. She looked around desperately, searching for someone, anyone, to support her. But Ruth lowered her gaze. Henry from the general store shuffled backward. Even those who had stood proudly in their judgment before now found the ground more interesting than the truth staring back at them. Pastor Cole's voice grew louder, sharper, cutting through the stale air. "You said it was the devil in her." Abigail flinched. Cole's gaze hardened. "But the devil was never in her. He was in you." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Someone in the back whimpered quietly. "You let pride disguise itself as faith," he continued. "You let fear become hatred. You, who claimed to love your neighbor, became the ones who placed nails in her hands while she fought for her life." Ruth's tears spilled over, and she stepped forward, her voice cracking. "We thought we were protecting the town, We didn't know how bad it was for her. Protecting the town, Cole repeated bitterly. From what? From a woman who was already carrying more pain than any of you could bear. From children who were blameless before they even took their first breath. The crowd stood in silence, every word striking deeper than the last. Grace said nothing. She stood at the edge of the square, clutching Lily, her face pale but unreadable. James stood beside her, his grip on Jacob protective, his jaw tense with a quiet fury. Cole turned his attention back to Abigail. Did you pray for her? Or did you pray about her, so your hand would stay clean while your words left blood on her door? Abigail finally broke. She sobbed openly, her knees buckling. I didn't mean to hurt her. I swear I didn't know. Cole stepped closer, his voice now quiet but sharp as glass. You didn't need to know the whole story to choose kindness. But you didn't, and now you want forgiveness to come cheap. Abigail collapsed to the ground, covering her face. Ruth followed, crying into her hands. Others began to crumble too, guilt spreading like a disease. But Grace didn't move. She didn't comfort them. She didn't speak. And maybe that silence was louder than any forgiveness they could have hoped for. Cole looked back at Grace, his expression softening. Then he turned back to the crowd, his voice final. The devil was never in her. He was in us. The words hung in the air, heavy, unrelenting. No one dared move. And then, from somewhere in the back, a quiet voice whispered, "But if the devil was in us, is he gone now?" The question lingered like a shadow, unanswered, as the square remained frozen between shame and the faint, distant hope that maybe, just maybe, grace was still possible. The ranch stretched wide under a golden afternoon light, the kind that painted everything in soft warmth but couldn't quite erase the memories stitched into the soil. The field swayed gently, but the air was heavy, thick with the weight of everything that had been said and done in the town. Grace walked slowly toward the corral, her steps measured, her arms still sore from holding Lily and Jacob. James followed a few paces behind, his expression unreadable, but his presence solid, as if he were a quiet wall of strength standing at her back. Inside the pen stood Shadow. The massive black bull was larger now, his muscles coiled with power, his coat gleaming in the fading sun. His eyes, dark and intense, locked onto her as she approached. There had been a time when people whispered that those eyes were cursed, that they carried darkness, that they reflected something evil. But Grace saw none of that. She saw the same silent guardian who had once stood between her and fear. She saw the creature that the town had turned into a myth to suit their poison. The wooden gate creaked softly as she stepped inside the corral. James inhaled sharply, but said nothing. Shadow didn't move. His nostrils flared, his breath deep and steady, and for a moment the world seemed to hold still, just her and him in a fragile balance. She closed the distance, slow and deliberate, until she was standing directly in front of the towering beast. The bull lowered his head slightly, his breath warm against her skin. And then Grace did something that made James hold his breath. She pressed her forehead gently against Shadow's. For a second, time stopped. Her eyes closed, and her voice came out soft, a whisper only the bull could truly hear. "You never betrayed me." Shadow let out a low rumble, his head tilting just enough to lean into her touch. Grace's fingers moved to his rough coat, stroking it gently. Her voice trembled, not with fear, but with something deeper. "The monster was never you," she said, tears welling but refusing to fall. "The monster was the fear in their hearts, the lies they chose to believe, the hatred they fed because it was easier than facing the truth." Shadow's breath huffed softly against her. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there, solid, unwavering. Behind her, James swallowed hard, his hands curling into fists at his sides. He watched the woman he loved, broken but unbowed, stand before the very symbol of everything the town had twisted against her. Grace stepped back slightly, her hand lingering on the bull's forehead for just one more moment. "You," she whispered, "were the only one who didn't judge me." The corral was silent except for the faint sound of the wind moving through the grass. Shadow let out a deep breath, a sound almost like a sigh, before turning his head slightly to watch her, his eyes calm. James finally spoke, his voice quiet but weighted. "Grace, are you sure you're ready to face them again?" She turned toward him slowly, her face soft yet resolute. "They're not the ones I came here to face," she said, glancing back at the bull. "I came here to face the only soul who stayed loyal when everyone else turned away." Shadow shifted his weight slightly, his massive body still but watchful. It was almost as if he understood. James looked at her, at the quiet fire in her eyes, at the unspoken forgiveness she'd found not in people, but in the innocence of a creature they once called a curse. And in that silence, something else lingered. A question. If a beast could be innocent, what excuse did the humans have? The answer didn't come. Not yet. It hung in the air, heavy, unresolved, waiting for someone, anyone, to be brave enough to face it. The Whitmore house glowed softly in the golden light of late afternoon. The walls, once silent witnesses to grief, now seemed warmer, almost breathing with quiet life. The windows stood open, letting in a soft breeze that carried the faint scent of the fields outside. Grace sat on the old wooden couch by the window, her legs still weak, but her eyes stronger than they had ever been. In her arms, Lily cooed softly, a tiny fist gripping the fabric of her mother's blouse. Beside her, James balanced Jacob on his lap, rocking him gently, his eyes fixed not on the baby, but on Grace. It was the first time in months that the house was quiet in a way that wasn't empty. For a long while, they just sat like that, breathing the same air, sharing the same silence. No words, no explanations, just the fragile peace of knowing they were all there alive. James finally broke the stillness. His voice was low, but there was no trace of the weariness that had haunted him before. "Now they'll know who you really are," he said. Grace looked up at him, her lips curling into a soft, tired smile. "I don't need them to know anymore," she replied. Her voice was quiet but steady, like someone who had walked through fire and come out whole. "I don't have to prove anything. I just need to live." James lowered his gaze for a moment, as if letting her words sink into the very foundation of his heart. He glanced down at Jacob, who blinked up at him with a kind of innocence that made the weight of the past seem lighter. Grace leaned back slightly, her head resting against the window frame. She let her eyes wander over the room. The same room where she had once folded under the whispers of cruel town, where her body had ached with sickness, where she had questioned whether she would ever see this day. Now, that room was filled with the sound of two tiny breaths, two tiny heartbeats. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was everything. Outside, the sun slipped lower, painting the fields in soft amber. Shadow moved quietly in the pasture beyond the window, his dark shape cutting across the fading light. Grace caught sight of him and felt a pang in her chest, not of sorrow, but of something close to gratitude, because even the creature they had called a curse had remained loyal when no one else had. She shifted Lily in her arms and looked back at James. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "if any of them will ever truly understand what they did?" James hesitated, his jaw tightened, but his answer came with a quiet honesty. "Some will, some won't, but it doesn't matter anymore. They can't take this from us." Grace nodded slowly. She looked down at her daughter, tracing a fingertip over the baby's soft cheek. "They can't," she whispered. For the first time in a long time, she believed it. The breeze carried the faint sound of the church bell from the town square, distant and hollow. Once, it had been a sound of dread. Now it was just background noise, no longer holding power over her life. She was no longer the woman they tried to bury in lies. She was a mother, a survivor, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she was free. James reached across the space between them and took her hand, his thumb brushing gently over her scarred knuckles. There was no need for promises, no need for grand declarations. The fact that they were here, together, was promise enough. And yet, even in the quiet peace of this moment, there was still a question that lingered in the air like a faint echo. Would the town ever change, or Or would its darkness just find someone else to break? Grace didn't know. Maybe she never would. But for now, she didn't need that answer. She only needed this. The warmth of her children against her skin, the strength of James's hand in hers, and the knowledge that the worst was behind them. For now, the wooden pews of St. Mary's creaked softly as the congregation shifted in uneasy silence. Sunlight poured through the stained glass windows, casting fractured patterns of red and gold across the faces of the townspeople. But no one seemed to notice the beauty in the light today. They were waiting, some nervously, some defiantly, for the words they knew were coming. Pastor Cole stood at the pulpit, his Bible open but untouched. His hands rested on the edges of the wood, as if he needed its weight to keep him grounded. His eyes moved slowly over the room, meeting faces that suddenly couldn't hold his gaze. Abigail sat stiffly in the front row, lips pressed into a thin line. Ruth shifted beside her, her fingers twisting in her lap. The pastor's voice, when it came, was calm, but it carried an edge sharp enough to cut through the room's stillness. "The devil doesn't always come with horns and a tail," he began. "Sometimes he speaks with our own tongues. Sometimes he lives in the whispers we share, in the stones we throw without lifting our hands." A ripple moved through the congregation. "We tell ourselves it's concern," he continued, his tone steady but heavy, "but it's poison. We convince ourselves it's truth, but it's venom. And while we are busy condemning, gossiping, and casting shadows over the innocent, we forget that God's greatest commandment was love. Not suspicion, not pride. Love." Abigail swallowed hard, her face paling. Cole stepped down from the pulpit and walked slowly toward the front pews, his voice growing quieter, forcing the congregation to lean in. "There is a woman among us, a woman who was mocked, judged, called unholy. They said she was cursed. They said she was marked by sin. But the only thing she carried was suffering. Suffering and life." He stopped. The air felt tight, like the entire church was holding its breath. "She was fighting for her children while we were too busy spreading lies to notice the truth. Tell me, Willow Creek." He turned in a slow circle, his eyes burning into every soul in the room. "What kind of God do you think you serve if you believe he smiles upon cruelty?" Someone in the back sniffled quietly. "We prayed for her downfall, when we should have prayed for her healing. We watched her bleed and called it justice. We saw her fall and said it was proof. But here's the truth you can't run from. The devil was never in her. The devil was in us." He let the words hang there, heavy and raw. A child shifted uncomfortably in the back row. An old man coughed and lowered his head. Abigail bit her lip so hard it nearly bled. Pastor Cole's voice softened, but the weight of it didn't lift. "Now you see her alive. You see her children breathing. And you know you're wrong. But will you admit it? Or will you carry that same silence, that same pride, into tomorrow?" He stepped back toward the altar, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous room. "God forgives. But do we? And more importantly, do we change?" No one moved. No one spoke. The church felt colder now, even though the sun still spilled through the stained glass. And somewhere in the back of every mind sat a quiet, needling question, one no one dared to say aloud. If it wasn't Grace this time, who will it be next? The sun dipped low over Willow Creek, painting the sky in muted streaks of orange and pink. From a distance, the town looked peaceful, like the kind of place where nothing ever changed. But you knew better now. A soft breeze moved through the open fields near the Whitmore ranch. Grace knelt in the grass, her laugh quiet but genuine as Lily and Jacob tumbled around her with clumsy toddler steps. James stood a few feet away, leaning against the fence, watching them with a gaze that held both relief and exhaustion. And there, just beyond the wooden rails, stood Shadow, the great black bull, once the center of every whispered rumor, lifted his massive head, his dark eyes calm and steady as he watched over them. He didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence alone felt like a silent vow. The camera lingered on that scene. A mother kneeling, children laughing, a father finally allowing himself to breathe. And then the voice came. In towns like this, silence cuts deeper than any knife. A wide shot of Willow Creek appeared in the distance, its streets empty, its homes glowing faintly in the twilight. Here, the tongue can kill faster than any sickness. And gossip doesn't just wound, it buries. Close-up of Abigail standing alone by her window, staring at her own reflection, her face pale, her lips pressed tight as if holding back words she could no longer speak. They will tell themselves it wasn't their fault. They'll say they didn't know. But the truth was always there. They just chose not to see it. The frame shifted back to Grace as she gathered her children into her arms. She glanced toward the fence, meeting Shadow's gaze for a fleeting moment. Her hand rested on Lily's tiny back, and her smile was small but unshakable. But love, the voice softened. Love survives, even through the cruelest poison, even after the harshest lies. Love stays, and it changes everything. The screen held that final image, Grace rising slowly to her feet, holding both children close as the wind moved gently through the grass. Shadow remained still, a silent sentinel in the fading light. And just before the scene faded to black, a single question echoed in your mind, refusing to let you look away. When it's your turn to speak, will your voice heal, or will it destroy? Imagine you're standing there, in the silent square, when Grace Whitmore appears, holding Lily and Jacob in her arms. She stares directly into the eyes that once tore her apart. The wind seems to stop. You hear Abigail swallow hard, struggling to justify her lies. You see Ruth lower her head in shame. And in the background, the firm voice of Pastor Cole echoes. The devil was never in her. He was in us. And you? If you were Grace, judged without mercy while fighting for her life, would you have the strength to return? If you were James, watching the woman he loves waste away while selling everything to save their children, could you bear so much silence and pain? Or if you were Abigail, condemning without knowing, would you have the courage to look into the eyes of the one you nearly destroyed? This story belongs to them, yes. But deep down, isn't it also ours? How many times have you witnessed a shadow, an innocent soul, turn into a monster simply because of people's fear or ignorance? How many times have you been a silent accomplice, while someone was torn apart by gossip, glances, and judgment? Think with me. If Pastor Cole, who always preached the truth, was capable of being wrong, who are we to point fingers without knowing what lies behind someone's tears? If Grace, carrying so much pain, still found the strength to forgive, what stops us from loving more and judging less? Now I ask you, directly, looking into your soul, if your voice echoes in someone's life tomorrow, will it be like Abigail's? Or like James's? Will it wound? Or will it save? Comment below. What moment touched your heart the most? Was it when Grace opened her eyes after the coma? When James pleaded with God, lost between faith and anger? Or when all of Willow Creek fell silent, realizing that the real monster was never Shadow, but the people themselves? Leave your reflection. It might touch someone who needs to hear exactly this today. And if this story made you feel, reflect, or even see the world differently, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to be reminded of the power of empathy. Show that there is still hope amid the voices that hurt. Subscribe to the channel now, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss more stories that transform, move, and heal. Together, we can create a space where words don't kill, but bring life back. Because in the end, it's not about what others did. It's about who you choose to be. So I leave this last question to echo in your heart. When people say your name, will it be remembered as a scar or as an embrace? Right? Share, reflect, and never forget. You have the power to be the